First of all, my apologies for the fact that there was no video from me yesterday. As you know, however, I have been unwell over the last few days, and I'm afraid I felt particularly unwell yesterday, so I decided to give myself a day off. Today, I'm slightly better, and as you can see, I'm back. May I, by the way, before I proceed, take this opportunity to thank everybody who has written very kind words of support to me as a result of my illness. Well, let's get back into things and discuss where we are. And before I press on with more recent events, I think perhaps it's as well to say just a few last words about the Russian withdrawal from Kherson region. And the point I want to make is that this is clearly the decision of one man overall, General Surovikin. And one may agree with this decision or one may not. One may think it's a good decision or a bad decision. There's been lots of arguments about this from many different points of view. People in the West have their view, people in Ukraine have their view, but of course in Russia and on Russian telegram channels this has been particularly hotly argued. But the fact is that Surovikin did make that decision. He made it known that it was his. He was on television with Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister. So he is publicly identified with the decision. He owns it. And that is something that requires a great deal of moral courage. Another general, a different type of general, might have decided to go with the flow. After all, Russian forces were successfully holding the front lines in Kherson region, and Surovikin could have gone along with that. He could have taken on, accepted the various risks that he outlined, the fact that the Novaya Kakhovka dam might be breached, causing flooding and trapping the entire grouping. He might also have been worried, discounted concerns about, supplies, try to build more bridges, more pontoon bridges, perhaps even try to reinforce the force in Kherson region. But Surovikin decided against doing any of those things. He decided that it made little sense to keep these valuable troops contained in this pocket where they were under constant attack by the Ukrainians and where the supply lines were being shelled and had to cross a river a kilometer wide, and also where there was apparently, according to Surovikin at least, and apparently to a lot of other Russian officials, a real risk that the Novaya Kakhovka dam might be breached. So Surovikin decided to pull the troops out, and he made that decision, and he made it publicly. And as I said, he owns the decision. And he didn't just make the decision, but he carried it out. And he carried it out, it must be said, with great efficiency. There was lots of expectations that there would take weeks to pull these thousands of troops out from Kherson region, that the Russians would have to leave large amounts of material and equipment behind. And it doesn't seem that any of that has happened. Undoubtedly, it is now, I think, universally accepted that the withdrawal from Kherson region began sometime before Surovikin's public announcement. I'm going to make a guess that it began on the day that the flag disappeared from the administrative building in Kherson region. If you remember, about 10 days ago, there was a brief flurry because the flag of the Russian Federation was no longer flying over the building which formerly housed the administrative offices of the Kherson region. And on that particular day, there was a comment by the late deputy governor of Kherson region, Kirill Stremusov, on Soloviev live television. He said that he blurted out a comment about the troops being withdrawn to the left, to the East Bank, and that he said other things that seemed to contradict that. But I suspect that that admission that the troops were being withdrawn to the East Bank was the truth. And perhaps even more importantly, I remember on that day reading a report from on a Russian telegram channel called The Two Majors, in which they said that the troops in Kherson region had been informed that there would be a relocation to the East Bank, and many of them felt very upset about it. So undoubtedly the relocation began, the withdrawal began before Surovikin's announcement. But the fact that he was able to keep the Ukrainians far from the crossing points through both effective use of military power, artillery, aircraft, all of those sort of things, but also skillful deception tactics, managed to get all the troops across in one piece, apparently left minimal equipment behind, if any at all. The fact that he was able to do all of these things speak of a certain efficiency on the part of this commander. Now, I make all of these points because up to this point, I've known very little about Surovikin indeed. I've known that he fulfilled a command role in Syria, where he was apparently successful, but then of course this war is very different from the war in Syria. And alongside General Lapin, who by the way has been, shall we say, removed from his post and perhaps given a different post after the criticisms he came under from people like Kadyrov and Prigozhin. But anyway, the fact is that alongside General Lapin, General Surovikin did play an important role in the capture of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and in the clearing of Lugansk region from the Ukrainian troops. So that was all I knew about Surovikin up to this point. Now I know a little more, and it's what I know about him now is important. It shows that he has the power of decision, that he's able to make difficult decisions. There's a famous expression in politics, sometimes attributed to the former French Prime Minister of the 1950s, Pierre Mendès France, to govern is to choose. I don't know whether there is any equivalent in military law, but anyway, it seems to me that a commander needs to have the power of decision, the moral courage to make decisions and to do so publicly in front of the soldiers and in front of the politicians. And Surovikin clearly does have that power of decision. And as I've said, he's also efficient. He's managed to carry out a withdrawal, a complicated operation across a river, a kilometre wide, and bring his forces out intact. So let's give him his due. I mean, it's a retreat, it's a withdrawal, but it's been carried out with some success, and that is a success which must be attributed to a great extent to Surovikin himself. Now, in saying that, when I say it's a success, I don't mean to suggest that it is a victory. On the contrary, I'm of the view that the withdrawal from Kherson region must be accounted a defeat. After all, the Russians have withdrawn and have surrendered a city that they had captured right at the start of the war, and which was a regional capital, and which they now claim to be a part of their territory. Winston Churchill, after Dunkirk, once said that wars are not won by evacuations, and I'm not suggesting in any way that this evacuation was a way of winning this war. But I'm talking about Surovikin at this point and my assessment of him, and I can start to see why he has the high regard of others, of people like Prigozhin and Kadyrov, and I think these points need to be made. Now, what he will do from this point onwards remains to be seen. There's been a lot of fighting going on elsewhere in the battle lines. As I discussed in my previous video, the one that came out on Friday, there's been significant Russian advances in Donetsk, around Donetsk city. The Russians have now captured a whole string of settlements near Donetsk city, and they seem to be getting closer to the point where they're going to surround and isolate the main hub of Ukrainian fortifications and concentrations near Donetsk city, which is in a place called Avdiivka. And of course, the Russians have also captured Pavlovka near Ugledar, and that is another advance which is connected to the greater battle around Donetsk, because Ugledar sits on the main transportation routes from Ukraine to the grouping, the Ukrainian grouping near Donetsk. So there's been quite a lot of positive news, if you like, from a Russian point of view there. Certainly positive news from the perspective of the people of Donetsk themselves, who still have to face repeated shelling from Ukrainian forces in Avdiivka and around Donetsk city. Patrick Lawrence, the intrepid, heroic journalist who reports on this war and who's been in all of these places on the battlefields, he has spoken of the importance to morale in the Donbass on the part of the people in Donetsk if this shelling that the Ukrainians have been repeatedly engaging in throughout this conflict, going all the way back to 2014, can be finally brought to an end. And it seems that over the last couple of days, a major step in that direction has been made. We're probably some distance from this. We'll see how things work out. But at the moment, the Russians clearly have the initiative around Donetsk, which they have had, by the way, since August. And further north, Ukraine continues to try to follow up on its success in Kharkiv region. Back in September, it's continuing to launch attacks, trying to break into Lugansk region, which has, as I've said, been entirely cleared of Ukrainian troops, and it's running into increasing fortified lines. And here again we see Surovikin's work, because he's talked about the fortifications he's been building, and one gets the sense that the lines in Lugansk region, in this area of northern Donbass, have been steadily hardening, and the Ukrainians appear to be bashing their heads against a brick wall and are losing lots of men and machines trying to do it. And of course, south between Donetsk city and the events in Lugansk region and Kharkiv region, northern Donetsk region, there is the unresolved Battle of Bakhmut. And here I think, again, Surovikin perhaps needs to somewhat exert himself. One of his major supporters has been Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, which has taken the lead in this battle, this huge battle in Bakhmut city. But it seems to me that the time has perhaps come when this practice of having different little wars being waged within the various battlefronts by local commanders and by local groups really needs to be brought to an end. And Surovikin, perhaps the first challenge that he has, or so it seems to me, is to bring this battle in Bakhmut to some sort of conclusion. It's been dragging on, as I said, I think largely because the forces that have been committed to the capture of Bakhmut have never been big enough in order to inflict what you might call, what the French call a coup de grace, a knockout blow. So instead, we've had long, slow, incremental, grinding advances by the Wagner group, which has had its benefit, I suppose, from a Russian point of view. It's bled the Ukrainians dry, but it's also prolonged the battle in Donetsk. And Surovikin is now the overall commander. He is Prigozhin and the Wagner group's commander as well as the commander of the Donetsk militia. And he's got his 300,000 men coming, and one would presume and expect that he's going to use them in some way now to clear up this unresolved business of Bakhmut and press on to the next target, which is apparently Kramatorsk. In his report to Shoigu, where Surovikin talked about the fact that the troops should be withdrawn from Kherson region, he spoke about the stabilization of the front lines, which is an interesting observation, by the way, and that points to the fortifications that he's been building up. He spoke about the build-up of reserves, and he spoke about offensive operations and about using the troops that he's reassigning from Kherson region for offensive operations, presumably when they've rested and refitted, which will be, I'm guessing, some weeks or perhaps even months away. But anyway, in the meantime, he's got hundreds of thousands of troops coming to reinforce his positions. And the obvious place now, I would have thought, to launch these offensive operations must be Donetsk, and he's got to, or should be working towards, clearing Donetsk and bringing the entire area of the Donbass, what the Russians refer to as the Donbass arc of operations, finally under Russian control. So I would have thought that those were his military priorities. He's got one other, though, and here we must turn to what the Ukrainians are likely to do. Of course, they have now captured Kherson city, but they're still west of the Dnieper. There is no realistic possibility of them crossing the Dnieper and following the Russian forces into the eastern region, in the eastern part of Kherson region. By the way, I should say that 60% of Kherson region is east of the Dnieper and is therefore still under Russian control. And the Russians have established their new administrative capital of Kherson region at a place called Genishek. But anyway, it seems that the Ukrainians can't really advance further in Kherson region. So that, and since their attempts to launch offensives in northern Donbass are, as I said, hitting a brick wall, perhaps this is the time when they might consider doing that which they have been talking about for months, and which was again referenced in an article in the New York Times just recently, which is launch their much touted and talked about offensive from Zaporozhye to the Black Sea, trying to cut the land corridor from Russia to Crimea. And they've now got a fair number of troops to redeploy. There's some uncertainty as to exactly how many troops the Ukrainians actually had committed to the Kherson offensive, and presumably they will want to keep some troops in Kherson region west of the west of the Dnieper in case the Russians attempt some kind of amphibious landing. The Russians do have amphibious landing warships, 7 of them, by the way, so that's not an entirely fantastic idea. Well, the Ukrainians have been talking again about launching this offensive, so they will redeploy some of the forces that they can from Kherson region to Zaporozhye. It'll take time to fit them out, to prepare them, and perhaps realistically this is an offensive too far. Surovikin is in charge. He knows, unquestionably he knows, the importance of the land corridor. He knows that this is one territory he cannot retreat from, and perhaps he doesn't need to retreat from. He's got direct communications to Russia there. He doesn't have any big river obstacles like the Dnieper in his way to keep his troops in Zaporozhye region and eastern Kherson region supplied. And of course he can also get supplies directly from Crimea, though the Ukrainians are boasting that they can bring Crimea within artillery range from Kherson. I doubt that they can do that to anything like the extent that some people are suggesting. I've looked at the maps and it looks to me very much at the farthest edge of artillery range. But anyway, one way or the other, I think that Surovikin, who's particularly keen, it seems, on fortifying positions, laying out dragon's teeth, putting out long trenches, building pillboxes. He's probably doing that with the same energy in Zaporozhye region as he has been in northern Donbass, probably even greater energy, of course. And let's not forget, he's got those hundreds of thousands of reservists being inducted into his military. Now, I don't know. I would have thought that this would be a problematic offensive for the Ukrainians to carry out. If they're going to succeed in it, they'll have to do it quickly. I don't think they can. And General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, apparently doesn't think they can pull it off either, because he's urging them to sit down and negotiate and agree a ceasefire. Something which apparently the Ukrainians don't want to do, and which some of the civilian officials within the Biden administration, the neocons in other words, entirely predictably are resisting. Well, anyway, we will see what happens, but I just wanted to say those things about Surovikin and about the overall situation at the moment. It seems to me that ultimately the events in Kherson region, dramatic though they are, have probably not made the great decisive change to the overall military picture. There will still be a big Russian offensive once all of the troops, all of the reservists have been inducted into the forces, the Russian forces in Ukraine. And what direction that offensive will take, well, I've expressed my guess. I think that it will be focused firstly on Donbass, and then once Donetsk has been cleared, I'm going to suggest that the Russians will then take the next step, which will be to advance from Donetsk all the way to the eastern bank of the Dnieper. In other words, to take all the territory between Donetsk, between the Donbass and the Dnieper, which will in effect, by the way, also further isolate Zaporozhye and perhaps complicate any further ideas, any future ideas that the Ukrainians might have for offensives beyond that. Now, As to longer-term Russian plans, I've said that the withdrawal from Kherson effectively means that any idea of an advance towards Odessa is now off the agenda. That's clearly not going to happen anytime soon. But I've been reading some really rather interesting discussions, again, on Russian Telegram channels, which have been suggesting that, in fact, this was never a practical option anyway, that advancing from Kherson region towards Nikolaev and then Odessa would have exposed Russian forces to attacks on their northern flank from the Ukraine, that it would have required hundreds of thousands of troops to carry out an operation like this, and that even if the Antonovsky Bridge and the Novaya Kakhovka Dam had been operating normally, it would have been a logistical nightmare to keep those hundreds of thousands of troops fully supplied across two bridges across a river that is a kilometre wide. I suspect that that was the original plan that the Russians had back in March. They probably did think at that time that if they took Kherson, they could then move on to Nikolaev, and indeed they came very close to Nikolaev. They apparently came almost close to encircling Nikolaev at one point. So I suspect that the Russians did have that plan back in March. Take Kherson city, move on to Nikolaev, and then move on from there to Odessa. But they quickly realized that it was perhaps overambitious. I'm going to venture a guess here that what basically killed that plan was the decision that was made at the end of March, on the 29th of March, to pull Russian forces back from around Kiev, Chernigov and Sumy. The Ukrainians had to relocate large parts of their army to defending Kiev, and that meant that they had insufficient forces to defending themselves on the southern fronts. But the moment the Russians pulled back, withdrew from these cities, all those Ukrainian forces were freed up. Most of them, of course, were sent to fight in Donbass. The Russian expectation that the capture of ETHEREUM would effectively blockade Donbass proved to be wrong. And of course, at the same time, it allowed the Ukrainians time and space to build up a military grouping that could then threaten Kherson region and in addition, any further advance towards Odessa. So I think that for all practical purposes, the Odessa operation has probably not been possible for a long time. At least that's what these commentaries on these channels, these Russian Telegram channels, have been saying, and they seem pretty well informed. They also point out, by the way, something else, which is that when the Russians, the Red Army, did recapture Kherson city from the Germans during the Second World War, and move on to capture Odessa, it didn't cross the Dnieper River from the east of Kherson region. Of course, in those days, the Antonovsky Bridge and the Novaya Kakhovka Dam did not exist. They're both post-war constructions. The Russians actually had crossed the Dnieper much further north, where it was narrower, and the Russian forces, the Red Army, advanced from Krivoy Rog and attacked Kherson from the north, or rather advanced towards Kherson from the north. And of course, that's in effect pretty much what the Ukrainians were trying to do. though, as I said, in practice, all their attacks were being repelled. So maybe if the Russians do eventually intend to take Odessa, they will also carry out some kind of offensive from the north. Perhaps once they've captured Zaporozhye, they can then consider some kind of river crossing. Contested river crossings are always very difficult, but we'll come to all of that shortly. And maybe at some point they will move on, take cities like seek to capture cities like Nikopol, Kryvyi Rog, and advance on Odessa and Kherson in that way. One thing I would say as I sort of wrap this summary up, which is that the Russians have made it absolutely clear that they're not pulling back, they're not giving up their claim to Kherson city. Genishek has been appointed a temporary capital. The Russians are reiterating that Kherson city remains Russian. They're giving every indication that at the end of this conflict, they anticipate that they will have it back. So, how they will do that remains to be seen, whether they'll try some kind of amphibious landing, as I indicated, or whether it will be done through some other means, I don't know. But anyway, that is where we are. So, where are we, as I said, in the overall conflict? I said that, at least in the short to medium term, the retreat from Kherson is not going to make a dramatic difference. We're probably going to see at some point a Russian offensive, a big Russian offensive coming in the winter. Surovikin has already promised it. I mean, when I said a big Russian offensive, he's talked always about an incremental offensive, an offensive carried out in stages. He's not talking about a big arrow offensive. But as I said, I think he'll want to clear the Donbass and then probably press forward towards the Dnieper. But his strategy, and this has been consistent with the Russian strategy from the outset of the war, has been, as he put it, to grind the Ukrainians down. That's what he said in his interview with Russia 1 television a few weeks ago. And his strategy to do that, well, we can see it. He's continuing with his attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure. I've spoken in previous programs about my belief that sooner or later he'll get round to attacking the Dnieper bridges as well. And of course, all of these battles that are taking place on the front lines with the Ukrainians trying to launch offensives which then get thrown back with heavy losses, they all work to that objective of grinding down the Ukrainians, carrying out heavy attrition. And we've seen that Ukraine is trying to call up another 100,000 men to replenish its army, which has apparently suffered these losses on this scale. And that is indeed consistent with Russian claims. And I have to say, I'm now seeing really rather distressing pictures of Ukrainian cemeteries with flags of Ukrainian soldiers, hundreds of them, suggesting that Ukrainian losses have indeed been horrendous. And of course, there's also the problem of equipment. Ukraine seems to be coming to the end, reaching the limit of the equipment that the West has supplied to it. I've been tracking the various new supply that have been provided from the United States. And if you want to do that, the best person to do it, the person who analyzes this best, is Brian Boletic at the New Atlas. And there's no doubt at all that, as far as I can see, that the peak of Western arms supplies to Ukraine actually came in the early summer. Since then, it's been dwindling. The United States keeps providing Ukraine with some more supplies. It's just trying to put together another arms package. It's refurbishing 90 old T-72 tanks, for example. But one senses that there's less and less on the way. And of course, we've even had reports from the West itself about the impossibility of the US continuing to supply Ukraine with amounts of 155mm ammunition that it needs, artillery ammunition, and even with HIMARS missiles. Apparently Ukraine was allocated something like a third of the total stock of these missiles, and there's intentions now to resume production. But again, Ukraine has been using up these missiles at a much faster rate than the United States can easily replace. By the way, on the topic of HIMARS missiles, a couple of months ago there were rumors that the Russians had managed to gain control of an entire intact HIMARS launcher through bribing Ukrainian officials. That was never confirmed. But it is now, in fact, confirmed that they do have at least one intact HIMARS missile, which is being examined by one of the design bureaus, one of the Russian design bureaus, which are getting to understand its secrets. Now, mentioning this, it's been noticeable to me at least that the HIMARS has actually been gradually losing its effectiveness. When they were first used, when they were first deployed back in August, they were extremely effective. They were fast, they were accurate, they operated in ways that the Russian air defenses had not yet understood, and they were very effective at hitting targets. Over time, that effectiveness appears to be falling as the Russian air defense system gets to understand the system better. But anyway, regardless of that, it still remains a potent system, but one which has perhaps been maxed out in terms of the extent to which it can be supplied to Ukraine. And on the topic of air defenses, well, I've talked much about this in previous programs. It looks like the air defense systems that the West is providing Ukraine are simply not up to the purpose of repelling the Russian missile and drone offensive. The United States and the Western powers have never faced or contemplated facing a missile and drone offensive of the sort that Ukraine is now experiencing. So their air defenses are not really designed for that, and they simply don't have the kind of comprehensive layered air defense system that the Russians have developed for their military going back all the way to the early 1950s. So a Ukrainian army which is perhaps weakening overall, reduced in numbers of men, reduced in material, banging its head against Russian fortifications that are getting harder, even as Surovikin builds up his forces in the rear. It's not a very, I'm not a military historian, but it seems to me a fairly classic Russian strategy. Trade space for time, build up your reserves, build up your forces, grind down your opponents, and then strike. It's what the Russians did, or so it seems to me, to Napoleon and to other commanders, to other Western leaders, particularly German ones, since that date. Anyway, there we go. That's my summary of the situation on the battlefields. It could well be that there are some people in Washington who have reached fairly similar conclusions. And I've spoken about General Milley because one of the great mysteries, and we've had ample discussions about all of this in our various programs on the Duran. For example, we had a very interesting live stream with Garland Nixon on Friday. I've done more programs about this topic, which I'm going to come to now, the diplomacy, with my colleague Alex Christoforou. But the fact is that all of a sudden, there is a sudden interest in the West in diplomacy. And the important thing to stress is that the point of origin is the United States. Now, I've given explanations for this before. I've said that the United States is heading for much choppier political waters. Now, the Biden administration had a reasonably successful midterm result. It seems as if the Democrats are going to hold the Senate, but it still looks as if the Republicans are going to gain control of the House. If the Republicans gain control of the House, they will be able to launch their own counterattacks against Biden's domestic program. I would have thought that things are going to become much more difficult for Biden than they had been previously. He will not, I think, face the ultimate potential disaster of impeachment proceedings or anything of that sort. And of course, with the Senate and with the federal government still under his control, he's going to be able to govern. But he's now going to be under much more pressure than he was. And of course, this is coming against a deteriorating economic picture. And of course, if the picture is deteriorating economically in the United States, it is deteriorating economically even more in Europe. And here I think there is now a grudging understanding that the entire attempt to suffocate Russia with sanctions has failed, and to create rifts between China and Russia has also failed, and that the last throw, if you like, the attempt to put this oil price cap on Russian oil, well, that's not going to succeed. The United States has now quietly told India that, yes, we accept that you can buy Russian oil at whatever price you want, because provided, of course, you don't use Western services, which, of course, the Indians are not going to do. They're going to use their own services and their own ships, and, of course, Russian services and Russian ships. So, with India, which is now becoming a major importer of Russian oil, refusing to play ball, with China refusing to play ball, obviously, with Turkey refusing to play ball, the oil price cap idea is essentially dead. Janet Yellen has come out and said rather bravely, I suppose, that she does expect that the Russians will nonetheless have to sell some of their oil in conformity with the oil price cap. I don't see why. It seems to me that what the Europeans, what Yellen have achieved, is a situation where India and China are now, and Turkey indeed, are now wonderfully placed middlemen. They can buy Russian oil at a discounted price, which is nonetheless going to be above the oil price cap, and then they can resell it to the Europeans and indeed the Americans at whatever price the market will take. And they've no incentive, in other words, to abide by this oil price cap, and they're not going to. And I don't see why the Russians would go along with the oil price cap in light of this, when China, India, Turkey, those countries are able to buy their oil at whatever price the Russians agree with them. So I don't see that this oil price cap idea has succeeded in any way at all. All it has achieved is that it has created an anomaly, a structural defect in the oil market, which will mean that from this point onwards, the oil price in Europe is going to be higher than it would otherwise be. This does not affect the United States in the same way, because the United States is self-sufficient in oil, but Europe from this point on is going to have to pay more for its oil, and of course it's going to have to pay a lot more for its natural gas. And whilst I'm on the subject of natural gas, it turns out that there is so much demand in the Far East for Russian liquefied natural gas that the Russians are no longer selling it at a discount. They're now selling their own liquefied natural gas to their customers in Asia, which, by the way, include Japan, at the full market price. So these attempts to suffocate the Russian economy are not succeeding. They're not succeeding in terms of the strangling of Russian energy flows. They're not succeeding in terms of the strangling of Russian food and other exports. It's gone little noticed, but it's now becoming increasingly clear that the deal that Putin and Erdogan made a few weeks ago, in which Russia agreed to re-enter the grain deal after the drone attack on Sevastopol, that was widely promoted as a Putin as a Putin backing down. Well, it's now clear that there was probably more agreed at the time than we're aware, because we're suddenly getting reports that Russian grain and Russian fertilizer locked up in European ports has now suddenly started to be released and is now being shipped to countries like Malawi and others. And there's a big export of fertilizer from the Netherlands. I think I mentioned that in the previous video. But anyway, this is now looking to be a larger trend. So we're starting to see more softening of the sanctions in that regard as well. And what about the microchips? The fact that there was this attempt to prevent Russia and indeed China importing microchips, and there were lots of stories about how the Russians were running out of advanced microchips and were having to import washing machines from Kazakhstan and Armenia, and in order to pull out the processors from those washing machines in order to make their hypersonic missiles and all of that. Well, all I will say is, even if that I don't place any weight on that fantastic story, but one way or the other, the Russians can't be so short of advanced microchips, because they've just ordered, the Russian Defense Ministry has just put in a further big order for Zircon hypersonic anti-ship missiles, which presumably use precisely these sort of chips. For the record, I've said this previously, I believe that all the chips that are used in Russian weapons that are made today are Russian. I think that the Retake Corporation back in 2014 was given the task by the Defense Ministry to develop processors that would supply all the needs that Russian weapon systems needed. I think this was done in response to the previous wave of sanctions in 2014. And I think that the Retake Corporation has been working hard to do that. And I'm going to say something else about this. I believe that it was the delay in the completion of certain Russian weapons programs, like the Armata tank, for example, and indeed the Zircon itself, is probably connected, and the various advanced Russian drone systems, is probably connected to the fact that Retake needed some time to develop and start making these microchips. This is obviously a classified secret operation, like most of what Retake does. There have been reports that the Russians are producing chips up to a level of 14 nm. I don't know whether that's true. Not as advanced, in other words, as those of Taiwan, but pretty advanced. And as far as I can see, they're able to produce their hypersonic missiles, much as they did before. And Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chair of the defense of the Security Council, Russia's Security Council, the man who seems to have an overall role in keeping track of what the defense ministry, of what the defense industries are doing, he's saying that Russian military production of all levels is actually rising. And I have every reason to believe that he's telling the truth. Anyway, perhaps there are some people in the United States, General Milley, the Pentagon, other intelligence analysts, who are able to look at all of this and who are coming to the conclusion, as General Milley has said, that Ukraine has gone as far as it realistically can, that there is now little prospect of any further successful Ukrainian advances, that Ukraine continuing with the war risks, on the contrary, exposing Ukraine to the Russian offensives which are to come, even as Ukraine grows weaker militarily, economically, as its army is bled white, as its weapon systems, the West's ability to supply it with weapon systems runs down, that all of that is going to make it much more difficult for Ukraine to withstand whatever blows General Surovikin has in mind over the next few months. And perhaps that's why, presumably that is why, we now see this flurry of activity to try to get some sort of diplomatic action underway. But I want to reiterate again that the initiative for all of this is coming from the United States. It is not coming from Russia. It is Jake Sullivan who apparently telephoned Nikolai Patrushev, Putin's national security advisor, and Alexei Ushakov, who is one of Putin's most important foreign policy aides. And it was Sullivan who went to Kiev and who told the Ukrainians to soften their positions and to show willingness to negotiate. And the Russians are sitting back and are being increasingly skeptical about all of this. In the meantime, Patrushev himself has been busy. He's been traveling to Tehran, where he's been meeting with the Iranian leadership And it's now very, very clear that Iran and Russia are forging an ever closer friendship. There's been a long conversation between Putin and President Raisi of Iran, and it's clear that the two countries are working hard towards economic integration. And obviously it's now clear that the military cooperation between the two countries is developing rapidly, at a very rapid pace, with the Iranians supplying drones to the Russians, and with the Russians probably or presumably preparing to provide Iran with fighter jets and other weapon systems. So Patrushev went to Iran. He met with senior Iranian officials there. Putin had this conversation with Raisi. Probably over the next few weeks or months, we will have some kind of summit meeting between the Iranians and the Russians, which will be an interesting event and one which will give us further pointers to where that particular relationship was going. I have to make this point. As of this moment in time, the Russians seem to be devoting much more diplomatic energy to talking to the Iranians and talking to the Turks. Erdogan and Putin are also due to have another telephone conversation very soon. And also, by the way, the Russians are still working hard on maintaining their relationship with the Saudis as well. The Russians seem to be putting much more diplomatic energy into all of this than they are into the somewhat muddled, incoherent diplomatic initiatives that the United States has been making, which clearly do not have the full support of the US government behind them. In the meantime, and to summarize, a G20 summit meeting is taking place in Bali. Putin didn't go. I discussed, in my opinion, the reasons for that were the Western powers are trying to isolate the Russian delegation. My own personal view is that the G20 is on its last legs. It's now clear that we are moving towards a division of the world into two camps, something that the Russians say they don't want, something that the Chinese don't say that they don't want. They all talk about the need for a multipolar system, but the reality is, whether the Russians or the Chinese like it or not, that the system is now becoming increasingly bipolar. In other words, it's two camps, and given that that is so, it's very difficult for me to see how a structure like the G20, which purports to bring all the major economies together, can really function. With more and more countries now intent on joining the BRICS group, with more and more countries intent on joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I can't help but think that the diplomatic energy of countries like Saudi Arabia, India, will become increasingly focused on the BRICS and on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and that they will start to leave the G20 far behind. Well, that's me for the day. It's a bit of a program summarizing events recently and trying to bring everything together, partly in response to the fact that I wasn't able to do a program yesterday. Well, as you can see, I'm back, and there'll be more from me tomorrow. In the meantime, remember, you can continue to follow. You can find all our programs on our other platforms: Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Telegram, and of course Rockfin, where we've now recently started. And if you want to support our work, you can do so via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And you can also And you can also, of course, go to our shop and buy the many wonderful things that you will find. There are magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to join and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today, and as I said, more from me soon, hopefully tomorrow.